Jason Statham, the action icon of the 21st century, has been relentlessly dominating the big screen for more than 2 decades, with an almost unbreakable image. The man who turned discipline into instinct, turned coolness into style, and turned every step he took in Hollywood into proof that strength doesn't need to be loud to earn respect. From the silent and dangerous driver in the Transporter to the unrelenting adversary in the Fast and Furious franchise, then the tough warrior standing alongside legends in the Expendables, Jason Statham has conquered one of the harshest stages in the world with iron discipline, unwavering persistence, and a will that almost never accepts defeat. Millions of audiences look at him and see one very simple thing: strength. A man who always controls everything, always walks as if nothing in life is big enough to make him flinch. But behind that solid image is a story that's not glamorous at all. It's raw, harsh, and sometimes full of loneliness. A childhood growing up in working-class neighborhoods where money was always scarce and opportunities rarely knocked. Years of wandering through flea markets, learning to hustle, bargain, and survive in a world where weakness had no place. A sports dream that stretched over many years, then quietly shattered when Olympic glory never came. Days of modeling, doing odd jobs, walking through London with a nearly empty wallet and an unclear future. And behind it all is a feeling that those who know him often mention: silence. Not the arrogance of a star, but the quiet of a man who'd been through too much before the world even knew his name. For many years, Jason Statham almost never spoke about the early chapters of his life. He let the punches, the chases, and the cold rolls speak for his past. But time has a very strange way of making people look back at themselves. And now, stepping into age 58, when the pace of life slows down just enough for old memories to return, Jason is starting to reveal more about the years before Hollywood opened its doors to him. Not glamorous stories of a star building a legend, but raw fragments of memory from a young man who once stood very close to a completely different life. And when looking back at everything that happened before the spotlight hit, one question emerges more clearly than ever: what truly made the man the world today calls Jason Statham? Because behind the action hero image that millions admire, there has always been a lesser-known story. A story of cold streets, missed opportunities, years of being lost, and a silent will that pulled a man out of the shadows before the world even realized he existed. And now, at age 58, when fame has become part of film history, the real story of Jason Statham is beginning to be told, not as a Hollywood legend, but as the journey of a man who had to fight life long before the cameras started rolling. If the story of Jason Statham's true journey surprises you, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next parts, where we will explore the tough years and the events that shaped the man he became. The truth can sometimes be brutal when people look at a legend and forget that before the spotlight, before the applause and the giant posters hanging in theaters everywhere, that person's life also started from a very ordinary place, even a very harsh one. For Jason Statham, that place wasn't Hollywood, wasn't the dazzling streets of Los Angeles, but a small and chilly town in England called Shirebrook, Derbyshire. He was born on July 26, 1967, into a family with no money, no fame, and certainly no connections that could open doors to the entertainment world. The Statham family was typical working-class England of that era, where every penny earned came at the cost of many exhausting hours of work and silent sacrifices. His father, Barry Statham, was a singer performing in small bars. Those weren't grand stages with sparkling lights, but smoky rooms where music played amid tables of drinks and loud conversations. Barry sang to make a living, not to become a star. His long nights often ended when the city was already asleep, and sometimes the money he brought home was just enough for the family to survive a few more days. Jason's mother, Eileen Statham, was once a dancer, but life rarely let her hold on to old dreams. To support the family, she worked as a seamstress. her hands always busy with needles and fabric. Those who knew her often said Eileen was a strong woman, but that strength didn't come from abundance. It came from having to stand firm in a life that was never easy. In the small house where Jason grew up, there was no luxury, no expensive things or lavish vacations. There were days when dinner was just simple portions divided to go around. There were mornings when the cold seeped through the windows, making the whole room silent. And Jason learned very early that life isn't always fair. His family also moved often, seeking cheaper homes, different neighborhoods, places where hope sometimes felt as thin as morning mist. When Jason was little, he often followed his dad to the bars where Barry performed. The boy stood in the corner of the room, listening to the music rise under the dim yellow lights. For many kids, music might be joy, but for Jason, it often came with images of tired men, arguments, and long nights where adults tried to forget life's hardships with a few drinks. That wasn't the childhood of cinematic dreams. That was the childhood of cold streets, small markets, working people trying to get through each day. When the family moved to Great Yarmouth, a windy seaside town, life didn't get any easier. The streets where Jason grew up had nothing like the romantic image many imagine of England. They were full of small shops, flea markets, and people always finding ways to make a living in a world that gave them few choices. It was there that Jason began observing the world around him with the eyes of a child learning to understand life. He saw how people haggled, bargained, sometimes cheated each other for a few extra coins. He saw men wake up very early to work and come home when it was dark. And he also understood that in that world, no one could wait for miracles. Perhaps those years were what created the silence that audiences would later always feel when looking at Jason Statham. It wasn't coldness created by cinema. It was something formed from the streets where he grew up, from days watching his parents work themselves to exhaustion, from the feeling that life always demands you be strong before you're ready. While many later saw Jason as an action star, the boy Jason of the 1970s only knew one simple but harsh thing. The world doesn't owe you anything. And if you want to survive, if you want to step out of those cold streets, you'll have to find your own way. No spotlight, no guiding hand, just the first lesson of life, quiet but unforgettable. In this world, sometimes no one will save you except yourself. The years of childhood in Shirebrook and then in Great Yarmouth left in Jason Statham's life something that many people later called survival instinct. When the family moved to the seaside town of Great Yarmouth, Jason was still just a boy. But the world around him was nothing like the gentle childhood stories many people imagine. Great Yarmouth wasn't a place of Hollywood dreams. It didn't have dazzling boulevards lit up with lights or opportunities handed out just because of luck. It was a working-class seaside town where flea markets were always bustling from early morning, where people traded all sorts of things to get through the day, and where every penny earned carried its own story. Jason grew up amid those markets. Makeshift stalls put together with wood, tarps flapping in the cold sea wind, vendors calling out to passers-by in hoarse voices. There, young Jason didn't just see ordinary trading. He saw quick deals happening, goods of questionable origin, tense haggling, and sometimes arguments breaking out right in the middle of the market. For a child, it was a world that was both frightening and fascinating. The men there always had their own ways of making money. Some worked hard, others found ways to bend the rules. But what they all had in common was that they were all trying to survive in a life that was far from easy. Jason observed all of it in silence. He learned to read other people's eyes, learned to tell when someone was telling the truth and when they were trying to trick you, learned to stand firm in a place where weakness could swallow you whole. Those lessons didn't come from school. They came from the streets, the markets, and the people Jason met every day. When he got a little older, Jason started participating in that world himself, not because he liked it, and certainly not because he dreamed of becoming a street vendor. But in the neighborhoods where Jason lived, opportunities weren't always clear. Sometimes the only path a young guy could see was the one right in front of him. Jason started selling at flea markets, just like many others. Fake watches that weren't genuine, perfume bottles of dubious origin. Electronics passed from hand to hand before reaching the customer. The job wasn't glamorous. It often happened in the cold wind, amid the noise of the market, with haggling that dragged on minute by minute. But for Jason, it was another school of life. He learned how to talk to strangers, learned how to convince people to buy something they might not even need, learned how to stand his ground when someone doubted him or even got angry, and more importantly, he learned that the world isn't always fair. Some days you made a little money. Some days you went home with your pockets nearly empty, but you still had to get up the next day and start over. Many years later, when Jason Statham had become a famous action star, he once looked back on that period with a smile mixed with weariness, not because he was ashamed of it, but because he understood exactly how it had shaped who he was. The roles Jason played on screen: smugglers, men who lived by their own rules, characters always ready to fight to survive, often carried a very real feel, not because Jason was a traditionally talented actor, but because he had once lived in a world very close to those characters. But at that time, the young Jason Statham had no idea that his years of street vending in Great Yarmouth would become part of the story the whole world would later hear. Back then, he only knew he had to keep living, keep making money, keep finding ways to get through each day. And sometimes, in the cold, windy mornings blowing through the seaside market, Jason might have wondered if his life would ever change, if there was any other path besides those market stalls, besides the exhausting haggling, besides the days when the future seemed to stretch only one more day ahead. But life rarely answers those questions right away. It just keeps flowing, quietly but relentlessly. And while Jason was still standing in the noisy market of Great Yarmouth, selling watches and perfume bottles to strangers, none of them, not even Jason himself, could imagine that that young man would one day become one of the most recognizable faces in world cinema. But before that happened, before Hollywood knew the name Jason Statham, life still had a long road ahead, and on that road, there was an escape that Jason hadn't yet realized. An escape that wasn't on the noisy streets or in the crowded markets, but in a completely different place, the cold water of the pool, where, for the first time in his life, Jason Statham felt he could take control of his own destiny. But before the movie lights shone on Jason Statham's life, before the world knew him as a cold and unrelenting action icon, there was another moment in his life when everything seemed to be heading in a completely different direction. After the long days standing in the flea markets of Great Yarmouth, amid the exhausting haggling and the people always finding ways to survive day by day, Jason began to find an escape he himself hadn't expected. That escape wasn't in the noisy streets, nor in the trading stalls. It lay in the strange stillness of water. Sports entered Jason's life almost by accident, but it quickly became the only thing that made him feel his life could go in a different direction. When Jason started practicing diving, he realized that in the chaotic world he grew up in, this was one of the rare places where everything could be controlled. Every approach run, every takeoff, every twist in the air had to be precise. There was no room for chance, no room for the gambles like in the market where he once made a living. In the water, everything depended on discipline, and Jason Statham, who had learned to endure from a very early age, quickly adapted to it. He began training for hours every day, cold mornings when most people were still sleeping. Jason was already at the poolside, preparing for dive after dive without tiring. Long afternoons when his body was exhausted, but the coach still demanded one more dive, then another. Diving wasn't a glamorous sport. It demanded absolute precision and near-infinite patience. But for Jason, it brought something he rarely felt in his life before: control. In the moment his body left the diving board and soared into the air, all the noise of the world seemed to disappear. No more noisy market, no more haggling, no more suspicious looks from strangers. Just the movement of the body, the wind rushing past his ears, and the water waiting below. That absolute focus pulled Jason away from many temptations that other guys in his neighborhood couldn't escape. While some old friends continued down the narrow paths of Great Yarmouth, Jason spent most of his time in the pool and the gym. Those years gradually led him to a milestone few could have imagined when looking at the boy who once sold watches at the flea market. Jason was selected for the British national diving squad. For a guy from a working-class town, that was a huge step forward. It meant harsher training sessions, international competitions, and the feeling that maybe his life really was heading down a different path. For more than a decade, Jason poured nearly all his energy into the sport. He competed in many international events, representing England at major competitions, including the Commonwealth Games in 1990. The moment standing on the high diving board, looking down at the deep water below, brought him a feeling of both fear and freedom. But sports, like life, aren't always fair. In diving, just one small mistake could ruin months of training. And no matter how hard Jason worked, no matter how many years he devoted to the sport, there was one truth he gradually realized. Success wasn't always within reach. Not every athlete becomes an Olympic champion. Not every effort leads to a medal. For Jason Statham, the years on the national team were a journey full of hope and quietly painful. He kept training, kept competing, kept trying to prove he deserved this chance. But somewhere deep inside, a question began to emerge. If diving wasn't the final destination, then where would his life go? The years on the diving board gave Jason many things: discipline, physical strength, and the ability to handle pressure, but they couldn't guarantee a future. And as time passed, as his body began to tire after thousands of dives, Jason started facing a hard truth to accept. The escape he found in the water might only be a temporary chapter in his life, because even after he spent more than 10 years perfecting every twist, every perfect entry into the water, there was still no guarantee that the world would remember the name Jason Statham. And one day, when the competitions ended and the pool grew quiet, he would have to step out of the water and face the question he had tried to delay for so many years. If sports couldn't save his life, then what would? For many years, while he was a member of the British national diving squad, Jason Statham's life revolved around a familiar but grueling cycle: waking up before dawn, training for hours in the cold water, then repeating it all the next day. To many people, diving is just a low-profile sport. But for Jason, it was once the only lifeline that pulled him out of the cramped streets of Great Yarmouth. For more than 10 years, he lived with the belief that if he was disciplined enough, persistent enough, one day the world would see that effort. He represented England in numerous international competitions, and the peak came when he competed in the Commonwealth Games in 1990. Standing on the diving platform at such a major event was something the boy who once sold fake watches at the flea market never dared to imagine. But sports, just like life, don't always write fairy tales. Jason's dives were the result of thousands of hours of training, of aching muscles and freezing mornings. Yet in those brutal competitions where the best athletes gather, sometimes the difference between victory and defeat is just a tiny moment. And when the event ended, Jason didn't stand on the podium to receive a medal. There was no shining medal hanging around his neck, no national anthem playing, just the familiar silence of an athlete who understood that his effort, no matter how great, still wasn't enough to change his fate. The years that followed passed in an indescribable feeling of limbo. Jason kept training, kept competing, but in his heart, a fear that many athletes face began to emerge. What happens when your body is no longer fast enough, strong enough, perfect enough for this sport? Diving isn't a long career like many others. It demands youth, flexibility, and near absolute body control. And time, as always, doesn't stand still waiting for anyone. Jason began to realize that no matter how many more years he gave to the diving board, the future ahead remained foggy. No big contracts waiting, no chance to become a famous sports star, just the next competitions, the next trips, and the question growing louder in his mind, is all of this leading anywhere? The painful truth is that sometimes dreams don't shatter in a single moment. They don't collapse like a building being demolished. They just quietly fade, bit by bit, until one day you look back and realize it's no longer there. For Jason Statham, the sports dream died in exactly that way. There was no specific day, no official announcement, just an increasingly clear feeling that this path no longer led to the future he once hoped for. After more than 10 years fully dedicated to diving, Jason began to drift away from the world he once believed was his destiny. The training sessions gradually decreased. The competitions became fewer and farther between. And then one day, he realized that the most important chapter in his life up to that point had come to a close. For many people, giving up a big dream can feel like losing a part of yourself. For Jason, that feeling was even heavier, because diving wasn't just a sport. It had once been the only escape from the life he feared returning to. But now, with that escape gone, Jason stood once again before the same question he had faced as a boy in Great Yarmouth. If this road ends, then where is the next one? There was no Hollywood in his sights back then. No movies, no scripts or cameras. Just a young man trying to figure out where his life would go after his biggest dream quietly left him. And just like so many times before in his life, Jason Statham had to start over from the beginning, in silence, in uncertainty, and with a question still unanswered. If sports couldn't save his life, then how would he live? When the sports dream quietly came to an end, Jason Statham's life fell into a void he had never prepared to face. For more than 10 years, everything in his life had revolved around the diving board and the water below. Sports had once given him direction, discipline, a reason to wake up every morning. But when that chapter ended, Jason suddenly found himself at a crossroads with no clear way out. No medals, no big contracts, no clear career ahead. Just a very simple but heavy reality. He had to find a way to live. In the days that followed, Jason did whatever he could. Not out of passion, but for survival. He went back to the familiar jobs from his earlier years, selling, small-time trading, looking for temporary opportunities to make money. Some days, he stood in crowded markets, trying to sell a few items to strangers. Some days, he took short-term gigs, doing whatever people needed done for a brief time before disappearing. Life back then had no long-term plan. Each day passed like a small negotiation with fate, how to get through one more day. But then, an unexpected door opened from a place Jason had never considered. Thanks to his athletic build and chiseled features, he began getting some opportunities as a fashion model. It was a strange turning point for a guy who had spent most of his youth in pools and flea markets. Jason started working for fashion brands, including Tommy Hilfiger and French Connection. To many people, this might have been a dream opportunity. The fashion world brought lights, cameras, and photo shoots set up in bright studios. But for Jason, it all felt very strange. He stepped into rooms full of flashing lights, wearing perfectly designed clothes, standing in front of cameras with the confident look the photographers demanded. But deep inside, he always felt something didn't fit. Beneath the fashionable clothes and carefully staged photos, Jason was still the boy who grew up amid the markets of Great Yarmouth, a boy more familiar with the noise of market stalls than the silence of studios, more accustomed to rough haggling than the gentle directions of photographers. Many in the fashion industry looked at Jason and saw a promising model. But Jason looked at himself and saw someone still searching for his real place in this world. The photo shoots ended, the lights went off, and he returned to the familiar feeling. He still hadn't found where he belonged. Those years felt like a period of limbo between two worlds. Jason was no longer a diver. But he wasn't anything else yet either. He existed in the space between past and future, trying to make a living, trying to figure out where his life was heading. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings after work ended, Jason might have thought about the streets of Great Yarmouth and wondered if any of this was really that different, because whether he was standing in front of a camera or in the middle of a crowded market, the feeling inside him was the same. He was still just trying to survive. But it was precisely in that lost phase, when Jason Statham was neither an athlete nor an actor and didn't even know what he would become, that his life was about to turn in a completely new direction, an encounter that at the time neither of them fully understood the importance of, an encounter that would pull Jason out of the world of photo shoots and temporary jobs and bring him closer to what the whole world would later know, cinema. And it all started with a very strange audition. Life sometimes changes not through a grand plan, but through a very ordinary encounter that happens on a day when you wake up with no idea that everything is about to shift. For Jason Statham, that moment came in the late 1990s, when he was still a man trying to find his place amid temporary jobs and fashion photo shoots. At that time, Jason had never thought about movies. Hollywood to him was a very distant world, almost completely unrelated to the life of a guy who grew up amid the markets of Great Yarmouth. But fate has a very strange way of stepping into people's lives. And that day, fate walked into the room in the form of a young British director named Guy Ritchie. Ritchie was then preparing a small crime film on a limited budget. The movie had no big stars, no massive promotional campaigns. What he needed were real-looking faces, people who seemed like they had actually lived in the world of black market dealers and shady deals. During the casting process, someone mentioned Jason Statham, the model, with a past of selling goods at flea markets. When Jason walked into the audition, he brought no acting experience, no theater school, no acting techniques. But Ritchie wasn't looking for a traditional actor. He just wanted someone who truly understood the world of street hustlers. And then the audition became one of the strangest stories in British film history. Instead of asking Jason to read the script, Ritchie handed him some items and told him to sell them. Not sell like a model in an ad, but sell like someone standing in a flea market, trying to convince a customer to buy something they might not even need. Jason didn't have to act. He just did exactly what he had done many years before. The natural voice, the wary eyes, the quick and sharp haggling, and the confidence of someone who had lived in that world. In those few short minutes, the audition room no longer felt like a casting session. It felt like a small market where Jason Statham had grown up. When Jason left the room, he probably still thought it was just a strange meeting. But for Guy Ritchie, the decision was pretty much made. Jason Statham wasn't an actor in the way Hollywood usually looks for. But he had something many actors can't learn: authenticity. And that very authenticity brought Jason to his first role in the British crime film called Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels. At the time, the film wasn't expected to become a phenomenon. It was a small project with fresh faces and a bold storytelling style. But for Jason, it was the first door into a completely different world. On set, he wasn't a model, not an athlete, not a flea market seller. For the first time, he became part of a story told through a camera. The strange thing was that many people on set quickly realized Jason didn't need to try too hard to get into character. The characters in Guy Ritchie's films were often dealers, con men, people living on the fringes of society. And Jason understood that world very naturally. The years in Great Yarmouth, the days standing in the cold, windy markets, the haggling with strangers, it all suddenly became part of his acting. When Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels was released, the film quickly caught the attention of British audiences. Guy Ritchie's fast, sharp, and energetic style made it an unexpected cultural phenomenon. And among that fresh cast, Jason Statham started to get noticed, not as an instant star, but as a distinctive face, a man who looked like he had lived through a lot before stepping onto the screen. To the film world, it was just a small movie that surprisingly succeeded, but for Jason Statham, it was the moment his entire life changed direction. Because for the first time since his sports dream shattered, he felt maybe he had found another path, a path he had never imagined before. And what makes this story so special is this: Jason didn't step into movies by becoming someone else. He stepped into it by being himself. And from that fateful moment, the boy who grew up amid the cold markets of Great Yarmouth began a journey that no one, even Jason Statham himself, could have predicted. The unexpected success of Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels opened a new door for Jason Statham. But that door didn't lead straight to the bright lights of Hollywood the way many people imagine. After that debut film, director Guy Ritchie went on to make another project in a similar style, and once again he called Jason back. The film was called Snatch. This time, the scale was a bit bigger, the pace faster, and the cast included some more famous faces, including Brad Pitt. On paper, it was a step forward. For Jason, continuing to work with Guy Ritchie felt like getting another chance to prove he wasn't just a one-time fluke in a small movie. On set, he still carried that familiar demeanor, quiet, observant, and working with the focus of an athlete. But the film world outside didn't move that quickly. When Snatch was released, the movie once again drew strong attention from audiences and critics. Guy Ritchie's bold style, sharp dialogue, and quirky characters made it a much-talked-about work. However, amid all of that, Jason Statham still wasn't the center of the spotlight. He appeared in the film, impressing with his natural and familiar coolness, but in Hollywood's eyes, he was still just part of a bigger picture. A supporting actor, a face suited for street characters, smugglers, gangsters. Not a star, not a lead, not someone the big studios were ready to build an entire project around. For many people, 2 successful films in a row might have been enough for a breakthrough. But Hollywood isn't a place that easily changes its prejudices. The industry always prefers familiar stories, actors with formal training, faces tested through many different roles, clear paths of progression. Jason Statham didn't fit any of those molds. He didn't come from a prestigious acting school. He had little stage experience. He had no long resume of complex roles. He was just a man with a very different past, stepping into movies almost by chance. And so, in the eyes of many producers, he remained a question mark. In the years that followed, Jason kept working, taking smaller roles, projects that didn't always get attention. Every time he walked into a casting room, he knew he had to prove himself from scratch. Nothing was guaranteed. No easy path just because the previous 2 films succeeded. This was a difficult period in a very particular way. Jason had entered the film industry, but he was still on its edge. He had proven he could appear on screen, but no one yet believed he could carry a film. And gradually, Jason began to understand a harsh truth that many young actors have to learn the hard way. Hollywood doesn't easily give second chances. One mistake can make you disappear. One unsuccessful role can make the phone stop ringing. And sometimes, even when you do well, it still might not be enough to change how the world sees you. In those years, Jason Statham had no choice but to keep being patient. He kept training, kept his body in athlete shape, kept waiting for the next role, and perhaps in quiet moments, he also wondered if movies were really the path for him. But Jason Statham's life always has a strange way of changing direction at the moments least expected, because while Hollywood was still hesitant to give him a big chance, somewhere in the film industry a project was taking shape. An action film with a central character completely different. A cold, disciplined, dangerous man, and almost written for Jason Statham. And when that opportunity appeared, it didn't just change his career. It changed the way the whole world looked at the name Jason Statham. And then that opportunity finally arrived in the early 2000s, when a new action film project began taking shape in the European film industry. The movie had a simple but highly compelling idea: the story of a professional driver who transports secret packages, a man who lives by absolute principles and never asks questions. That film was called The Transporter. When the producers started looking for an actor for the lead role, they didn't want a too familiar face. They wanted a man who could bring a real sense of danger, someone who looked like he had actually lived in the world of shady deals and cold rules. And somewhere on the list of names being considered, Jason Statham began to stand out as a strange but highly promising choice. When Jason read the script for the first time, the character Frank Martin seemed to reflect so many parts of his own life. Frank Martin is a man who lives by absolute discipline: no asking the client's name, no changing the deal, no opening the package. Three simple rules that are never broken. In Frank Martin's world, everything has to be precise, just like a perfect dive from the high board into the water. When Jason stepped onto the set of The Transporter, he didn't bring a lot of complicated acting techniques, but he brought something few actors have: a body trained like an athlete's, the reflexes of someone who once lived in the street environment, and a quietness that had become part of his personality. The action scenes in the film weren't just relying on stunts. Jason performed many of the dangerous moves with his own body: the quick punches, the high-speed chases, the movements precise down to the second. All of it made Frank Martin stand out from many previous action heroes. Frank Martin isn't a talkative guy. He doesn't need long speeches to prove his strength. He just acts. And when the film was released in 2002, audiences began to notice something very special. Jason Statham didn't look like an actor trying to become the character. On screen, he looked like Frank Martin was his real self: the cold eyes, the low, deep voice, the slow but fully controlled walk. All of it gave the feeling that this wasn't a role he had memorized. It was like a part of his personality that had existed long before. The years growing up on the streets of Great Yarmouth, the days standing selling goods at flea markets, the grueling training sessions with the national diving team, it all seemed to have prepared Jason Statham to step into this character without needing to change much. Audiences felt that authenticity immediately. The Transporter quickly became a notable success in the action genre. It didn't just attract European audiences, but spread to international markets. And for the first time since entering film, Jason Statham was no longer seen as a supporting actor in British gangster movies. He became the center of the story. A new action star began to take shape, but what made the success of The Transporter so special was the way it changed Jason's image in the eyes of audiences. Before that, he was a man appearing in British crime films, a familiar face but not truly standout. After this film, he became something else: a cold, precise, almost unbreakable action hero. Frank Martin became the icon of a new kind of character: not loud, not flashy, but dangerous in a very quiet way. And Jason Statham was the one who brought that icon to the screen. From that moment, his career began to shift in a completely different direction. Hollywood, which had once hesitated when looking at Jason Statham, started paying attention. Producers realized this man had what audiences loved: authenticity. Not the polished perfection of stars trained in acting schools, but the raw strength of someone who had lived in harsh worlds. And that's why when audiences watched Jason Statham as Frank Martin, they didn't feel like they were seeing an actor playing a hero. They felt like they were seeing a real man who belonged in that world. A man who didn't need to try to be dangerous, because life had taught him how to be that way long before the cameras started rolling. After the success of The Transporter, Jason Statham's life entered a completely different phase. For the first time since stepping into film, he was no longer on the edge of the industry. Producers began to see what they hadn't fully believed before: Jason Statham could become a true action star. The phone started ringing more often. New scripts appeared on his table. The roles were no longer shadowy supporting characters, but the center of the story. But along with that opportunity came a price that not everyone could see. Because the world of action films isn't built just with lights, cameras, and audience applause, it's built with sweat, bruises, and sometimes moments when the line between cinema and real danger becomes very thin. Jason quickly dove deep into the action genre, where an actor's body almost becomes the main tool for storytelling. In the years that followed, he took on a series of high-intensity projects, most notably Crank and Death Race. Those films didn't just require Jason to show up in front of the camera. They required him to run, jump, fight, chase, and perform stunts that many other actors would hand off to stunt doubles. But Jason Statham isn't the kind of star who likes to stand aside and let someone else handle the hardest parts of the job. From his days as a diver, he was used to controlling his body in dangerous situations. And when he entered film, he brought that philosophy with him. Jason wanted to perform as many action sequences as possible himself. Not because he wanted to show off, but because he believed audiences could feel the difference between a real shot and one completely staged with effects. In Crank, his character had to race through crowded streets, jump from dangerous heights, and constantly engage in brutal fights. The film was shot at a near non-stop pace, forcing the entire crew to keep up with the almost explosive energy Jason brought to the screen. But behind those adrenaline-filled shots was a reality few people saw. Jason's body began paying the price for every punch, every fall, every time he threw himself into danger. Bruises became routine. Aching muscles after long shooting days lasted well into the night. And sometimes the exhaustion built up not just physically, but mentally too. When he joined Death Race, the level of danger in the action scenes rose even higher. The film revolved around deadly car races in a brutal future world. Armored cars speeding at high velocity, explosions, violent crashes, all of it created a filming environment where any small mistake could lead to serious consequences. Jason stuck to his principle: perform as many dangerous stunts as possible, but that also meant putting himself in situations where just one moment of lost focus could turn into disaster. There were shooting days that ended when it was pitch dark, and Jason returned to his hotel room with a body so exhausted he could barely move. But the next morning, he was back on set, ready to do it all again. Gradually, a new reputation began spreading in the film industry about Jason Statham. Not just an action star, but a man willing to do himself what many others avoided. That made him a special choice for directors wanting authentic action scenes. But it also kept danger very close. Throughout his career, Jason has been through many on-set accidents. One of the most dangerous incidents happened during a high-speed driving scene. The car's braking system suddenly failed, and the vehicle plunged straight into the water. In that moment, everything happened too fast to think. Jason could only react on instinct, the instinct of an athlete used to facing danger. He managed to escape the car before it sank completely. After that incident, many in the crew said Jason came close to losing his life just for one shot. But for Jason Statham, that was just part of the job he had chosen. On screen, audiences saw a man who never backed down from danger. In real life, that man lived by the same principle. However, the deeper he went into the action film world, the more Jason understood that the price of becoming a star in this genre wasn't just in physical wounds. It was also in the constant pressure to maintain a strong image, to keep performing increasingly dangerous stunts, to prove he still deserved the position he had earned. And sometimes, in the quiet moments after the cameras stopped, Jason Statham probably felt clearly that the path he was on wasn't an easy one. It was a path of falls, injuries, and getting back up to continue when the body almost didn't want to anymore. But that was also the very path that turned the boy who once sold fake watches at the Great Yarmouth flea market into one of the most memorable action faces in modern cinema. After many years of throwing himself into dangerous action films, the name Jason Statham gradually became a familiar part of the genre. But Hollywood is a strange place. Yesterday's success never guarantees tomorrow's position. And even after Jason had proven himself through so many films, a new challenge still waited ahead, sharing the stage with the legends who had defined an entire era of action movies. That opportunity came when he was invited to join a special project, the film that gathered the biggest stars of the genre, The Expendables. This wasn't just a movie. It was like a reunion of the action icons who had dominated the screen for decades. At the center of the project was Sylvester Stallone, the man who created legendary characters like Rocky and Rambo. Alongside him were familiar faces to action fans, people who over the years had become symbols of strength and toughness on screen. For Jason, stepping onto the set of The Expendables felt like walking into a room full of giant statues. The men he had watched on screen as a young man were now standing right in front of him, and in a brief moment, Jason probably felt the weight of that familiar question. Do I really belong here? But cinema has a strange way of erasing the distance between generations. In The Expendables, Jason wasn't just standing next to the legends. He became an important part of the team. The character Lee Christmas, a cold warrior with razor-sharp knife skills and an unforgiving demeanor. Audiences quickly realized that among the faces famous from the 80s and 90s, Jason Statham brought a different energy, faster, sharper, and carrying the breath of a new action generation. But even as the film succeeded and continued with sequels, Jason never let himself forget one thing: Hollywood always changes. And to survive in that world, he had to keep proving himself. The next opportunity came when Jason stepped into one of the biggest film franchises on the planet, the Fast and Furious series, specifically Part 7. In this installment, Jason appeared as Deckard Shaw, a dangerous, intelligent, and almost unbeatable character. Unlike many villains who show up just to be quickly defeated, Shaw was a real adversary, a man capable of fighting on equal terms with the franchise's main characters. In the world of Fast and Furious, where speed, power, and loyalty are always paramount, Jason Statham brought a very different kind of coolness. His character didn't need to talk much. His eyes and actions were enough to make audiences understand this was someone not to be underestimated. And then, in one of the franchise's most memorable confrontations, Jason shared the screen with Dwayne Johnson, two men with completely different styles. One with massive power, the other with agility and precision, created action scenes that kept audiences glued to the screen. But behind those spectacular shots was a truth rarely mentioned. Standing among the big stars, amid film franchises worth billions of dollars, Jason Statham still carried the familiar feeling from his early days, the feeling that he had to fight to hold his position, not with words, not with glamorous interviews, but with work. By showing up on set every day with the same focus, the same discipline that had followed him since his days as a diver. People who have worked with Jason often say he never acts like a big star. He arrives on time. He trains before every shot. And he's always ready to perform the toughest stunts the script demands. Perhaps that's why, among the action film legends, Jason Statham didn't become their shadow. He became part of the next generation. A man who doesn't need to shout to prove his strength, because the path he walked, from the cold, windy markets of Great Yarmouth, through the grueling training years in the pool, through the near-death moments on set, said it all. And even when standing among the legends he once admired, Jason Statham still held to one simple principle: every day is a new battle, and the only way to survive in Hollywood is to never stop proving you belong there. But behind the image of an action star standing shoulder to shoulder with legends, Jason Statham's life has always carried a reality that audiences rarely see. Action films can make everything look spectacular on screen, Exploding cars, jumps from dangerous heights, battles that seem impossible to survive. But when the cameras stop rolling, the line between acting and real danger sometimes becomes frighteningly thin. Throughout his career, Jason has come very close to moments that could have changed his entire life. One of the scariest incidents happened during a high-speed action scene. It was a normal shooting day on set. Jason was driving for a chase sequence, something he had done dozens of times in previous films. Scenes like that demand absolute precision. The speed has to be exact, the distance perfect, everything timed to what the director requires. But sometimes, no matter how well prepared, a small mistake can lead to disaster. In that shot, the car's braking system suddenly failed. In just a few short seconds, Jason realized the vehicle was no longer under his control. The car veered straight toward the edge of the road, then skidded into the water. For anyone else, that could have been a moment of panic. But Jason reacted on the instinct of an athlete who had spent thousands of hours training in water. As the car began to sink, he quickly opened the door and escaped before it went under completely. Crew members later said that if Jason had reacted even a few seconds slower, things could have ended very differently. But that wasn't the only time danger came so close. In many other action films, Jason had to perform scenes involving water, fire, and falls from great heights. Once, during a fight scene near water, he was nearly pulled under too long while executing a complex stunt. Those moments passed so quickly that when it was over, Jason could only stand silently for a few seconds to realize he had just escaped a potentially tragic situation. What makes those incidents so frightening isn't just the accidents themselves. It's the way they remind Jason of the truth of the profession he chose. On screen, audiences see a man who always wins, a man who seems unbeatable. But in real life, every action scene carries real risk. A fall at the wrong angle, a car out of control, a small miscalculation, and it can all end in an instant. After such accidents, many ask Jason why he still performs so many dangerous stunts himself. His answer is always simple. He believes audiences deserve to see authenticity. But deep down, those experiences also left him with another thought. Every time he steps onto a set, Jason knows he's placing himself on a very thin line. On one side is the career he built with sweat and discipline over many years. On the other are risks that just one moment could destroy everything. Perhaps those near-miss moments with danger made Jason Statham look at life differently. When you've been so close to the boundary between safety and disaster, you start to understand that time isn't infinite. The movies, the action scenes, the audience applause, all of it can disappear very quickly. And perhaps that's why, over the years, Jason began searching for something beyond Hollywood's lights, something quieter, something that could make his life not defined only by dangerous stunts on screen. And it was during that phase of his life, when his career was solid, but his mind began seeking peace, that a woman entered Jason Statham's life and changed the way he saw the world forever. After years of living amid dangerous shoots and near misses that almost took everything, Jason Statham's life seemed to grow accustomed to the rhythm of tension and pressure. Each new film brought fresh challenges, bigger action sequences, stricter demands. On the outside, audiences saw a strong, cold, almost untouchable man. But deep inside, after so many years living on the fragile line between danger and success, Jason began to realize that life couldn't revolve solely around action scenes and movies. Even the strongest person still needs a place to stop, a place where the noise of the world can quiet down. And it was during that phase, when his career had stabilized but his soul began seeking peace, that a woman entered his life. That woman was Rosie Huntington Whiteley. When Jason and Rosie first met around 2010, many in the media didn't think the relationship would last. The age gap between them was nearly 20 years. Jason was already a famous action star by then, a man who had been through many harsh chapters in life. Rosie was a young model appearing on fashion runways and major ad campaigns. To many outsiders, they seemed to belong to two completely different worlds. And so from the start, plenty of people doubted the relationship would be anything more than a short Hollywood fling. Articles appeared, rumors spread, and many waited for the day the two would quietly part ways like so many other celebrity couples. But what the media didn't see was how that relationship gradually became a very important part of Jason Statham's life. Rosie didn't enter his world as a fan admiring an action star. She entered as someone who understood that behind the strong on-screen image was a man who had faced many trials. While Jason was used to the noisy days on set, Rosie brought a different pace, gentler, calmer. People close to them have said Rosie had a very natural way of making Jason slow down, not with grand advice, just with her presence. In quiet evenings, when Hollywood's lights no longer shone on their lives, Jason began to find a feeling he rarely had before: peace. For a man accustomed to living in dangerous action scenes, that feeling could be more valuable than any success. Over time, the relationship between Jason and Rosie not only survived the initial media skepticism, but grew even stronger. They went through years together as Jason's career continued to develop, but his personal life gradually became more balanced. The man who once lived amid the cold markets of Great Yarmouth, who once threw himself into dangerous stunts on set, now had someone by his side not because of Hollywood's glamour, but because of who he truly was. Rosie became the friend Jason could trust, the companion on life's long journeys, and the place where he could find peace after years in the high-pressure rhythm of the film industry. And perhaps it was in that relationship that Jason Statham began to understand that a man's true strength doesn't lie only in the battles he wins on screen. Sometimes true strength lies in knowing when to stop, in cherishing the people around you, and in knowing that after all life's battles, there is still a place you can call home. But Jason Statham's story didn't end there. Because after all the years of fighting to survive, after the near-fatal accidents, and after finding love in his life, a new chapter awaited him, a chapter he had never imagined before: becoming a father, after many years living in the non-stop pace of the film industry. After the action movies, the long trips, and the on-set brushes with danger, Jason Statham's life began to enter a completely different chapter. A chapter that, if someone had told the boy who grew up amid the cold markets of Great Yarmouth many years earlier, even Jason back then might have found hard to imagine. Because after all the paths he had traveled, after standing so close to failure and moments when he nearly lost everything, what changed his life most profoundly wasn't a new movie or a big contract. It was family. After his relationship with Rosie Huntington-Whiteley grew increasingly solid, Jason's life began to settle into a different rhythm. No longer just days of filming from morning till night. No longer just constant flights between cities. In their home, a new future was forming, quieter, but carrying deeper meaning than any role on screen. In 2017, Jason and Rosie welcomed their first child, Jack Oscar Statham. That moment marked a major turning point in the life of the man once used to on-screen battles. When he first held his son in his arms, Jason was no longer the action star millions knew. He was just a new father, standing before a tiny being who depended entirely on him. People close to Jason say that since becoming a dad, he began to change in a very clear way. The man, once accustomed to a fast and stressful life, started learning to slow down. Mornings were no longer just for physical training or preparing for dangerous stunts. Sometimes they were simply quiet moments at home, where Jason sat beside his son and watched life pass at a completely different pace. And then a few years later, their small family welcomed another new member. Their daughter Isabella James Statham was born, bringing another source of light into Jason and Rosie's lives. From a man who had spent most of his life fighting circumstances, Jason now had to learn a completely new role, father to two children. That role had no script, no director, no second take if you made a mistake. But perhaps that's exactly why it became more important than any film he had ever been in. People who have worked with Jason for many years say they noticed a clear change in how he viewed life. He remained the disciplined man, still kept his habit of training and working seriously on set. But now, whenever he talked about the future, Jason didn't just talk about film projects. He talked about family. The man who grew up in neighborhoods where everyone had to fend for themselves was now building a home for the most important people in his life. There was a new gentleness in the way Jason spoke about his children, a patience that perhaps the harsh years before had prepared him for. Because if life has taught Jason Statham anything, it's to cherish the things you once thought you might never have. The man who once stood in cold, windy markets, selling watches and perfume to strangers to make a living, now walked into a room where two children called him Dad. And in that moment, every movie, every award, every bit of Hollywood fame seemed so much smaller compared to what was happening right in front of him. Jason Statham's life was once defined by survival, then by his career. But now, looking at his small family, he began to understand there are things even more important than all of that. The man who once had to fight to survive in the harsh world of his youth now became a devoted husband and father. And perhaps after all the battles life threw at him, that was the greatest victory Jason Statham ever achieved. But as time continued to pass and Jason drew closer to age 60, a new question began to emerge. Not about his career, not about fame, but about the true meaning of the journey he had traveled. Because, when looking back at all those years, the world began to realize something they had perhaps felt for a long time. The real story of Jason Statham was never just the story of an action star. Time flies faster than people think. When looking back at the journey he's traveled, Jason Statham now stands at age 58, an age when many people start looking to the past more than chasing the future. To audiences around the world, his image seems all too familiar. A cold man, a Hollywood warrior, a face that always walks out of explosions, chases, and brutal battles seemingly never truly defeated. In dozens of action films, Jason Statham often appears as a man almost without fear. Piercing cold eyes, steady steps, fast and precise strikes. To many people, that's Jason Statham. But when the film lights go out and life returns to its normal rhythm, the real story of this man is far different from the image the world sees on screen. Because Jason Statham wasn't created by Hollywood. He was created by life. He was created from the years of poverty in a working-class family where money was always scarce and opportunities rare. He was created from the cold, windy streets of Great Yarmouth, where a young man had to learn to survive before learning to dream. He was created from the days standing in flea markets, selling fake watches and perfume to strangers just to scrape enough money for the next day. And then he was forged by the grueling years in the pool as a member of the British National Diving Squad, where every dive demanded absolute perfection. But even after devoting more than 10 years to the sport, that dream quietly shattered. No big medals, no clear path ahead. Just a young man forced to start over from scratch. Then life threw him into another journey. Temporary jobs, fashion photo shoots where he never felt he belonged, until one fateful day when he met Guy Ritchie and stepped into the film Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels. No one back then thought the guy who once sold goods at flea markets would become one of the most famous action faces in world cinema. But step by step, Jason Statham kept moving forward, from Snatch to the real turning point with The Transporter. Then intense action films like Crank and Death Race. He fought not just on screen, but in real life too, where every dangerous shot carried real risk. There were accidents that nearly ended everything. There were moments where just 1 second of delay could have changed his entire fate. But Jason got back up, time after time, and then he stood alongside the legends of the action genre in The Expendables, facing off against big stars in Fast and Furious 7. But even when standing among Hollywood's icons, Jason Statham still carried that familiar feeling from his early years, the feeling that he had to keep fighting to prove himself. Perhaps that's why, stepping into age 58, when looking back at everything that happened, Jason understands that his story was never just the story of a movie star. It is the story of a man shaped by poverty, by failure, by discipline, and by thousands of times getting back up after falling down. Because Jason Statham's life wasn't a straight road to success, it was a journey full of twists, detours, moments when the future seemed non-existent. And perhaps that's exactly why, when audiences see him on screen, they feel something very real. Not just acting, but a man who truly lived through what his characters represent. When he steps off set and returns to his small family, beside Rosie Huntington-Whiteley and their 2 children, Jason Statham no longer needs to prove anything to the world. Because the man who once grew up amid cold markets has now built a life he once thought impossible. And when looking back at it all, perhaps the world is finally beginning to understand what they've always felt but never truly named. Some actors play heroes. Jason Statham became one. Long before Hollywood ever noticed, the story of Jason Statham isn't just the journey of an action star. It's also an emotional reminder of the price many people have to pay before the world sees their success. When looking back at the details in this story, one can't help but feel a pang of sorrow for the boy who grew up amid the cold, windy markets of Great Yarmouth, where Jason had to sell fake watches and perfume just to survive. That wasn't the childhood of a film legend. It was the childhood of a working-class kid who had to learn survival from a very early age. Then came the sports dream that lasted more than 10 years in the British National Diving Squad, where he trained with discipline every day but ultimately left without medals or a clear future. For many, that might have been the end of hope. But Jason Statham's life shows something very characteristic of the spirit Americans have always cherished: the ability to get back up after failure. From temporary jobs, days modeling for brands like Tommy Hilfiger or French Connection while still feeling out of place, to the fateful meeting with director Guy Ritchie in Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, Jason gradually changed his own fate. Even as he became an action star with The Transporter, then faced dangerous on-set accidents and the pressure of standing alongside legends like Sylvester Stallone or Dwayne Johnson, he kept moving forward. That's why this story doesn't just inspire admiration, it moves people emotionally. It shows that behind every strong person are years of hidden pain few ever see. For American society, where the American dream always encourages people to overcome adversity, Jason Statham's journey is clear proof that a poor background isn't a sentence for the future. What matters isn't where you start, but whether you have enough discipline, enough persistence, and enough courage to keep getting back up after every stumble. And sometimes the people who have been tested the most by life become the strongest symbols of hope. If the story of Jason Statham's full of hardships journey makes you reflect on the power of will and resilience, please hit subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring the real-life stories behind the legends Hollywood creates. Thank you for joining me to the end of today's story, and see you in the next video, where we'll keep uncovering the emotional journeys of people who turned adversity into strength.